All right, take two. So, this is another episode of Critical Wade Theory, and this is another show within a show sort of thing. It's part of my new series, Right Wingers Want to Be My Guest. And this is the White House Faith Advisor edition. So, how fancy. So, my podcast is far from being the most popular. Sure, I have some episodes that have thousands of views or listens. One even has over 100,000, which is doing pretty good, That's not so bad. But it's been hit or miss. I could totally imagine right wingers in my audience and other people as well making fun of my show for not being more popular or for this or that reason, maybe an episode is just too boring or they're annoyed by my voice or something like that. Any number of things. Now, to be fair to myself, it is pretty much just me here, and occasionally, whatever publicists will reach out to me. I sometimes get guests on the podcast, and I'm doing that more than I used to in the past. Usually, when I would have PR contacts for interviews, it would just be for another website or something. But in this day and age, it's more sensible for me to focus on the podcast. I don't really have a team here. There is no CWT team. It's really just me talking into my laptop mic with whatever notes I've assembled on a given topic. Nevertheless, right wingers sometimes reach out to me suggesting that, unlike many liberals or leftists, they don't care so much how popular someone is or unpopular, whatever. You know what I'm trying to say. You don't have to be like routinely getting millions and millions of followers in order for them to reach out. And they really want to spread their narrative anywhere and everywhere, every nook and cranny of the internet, basically. So, I think there are some lessons out there for those not on the far right. Feel free to reach out to me and others like me if you are, a regular liberal or leftist or something like that. Because if you don't try to keep your narratives flowing, the right wingers will dominate in your place. So definitely reach out to some smaller, lesser known content creators if you have that kind of time. And I know some of you do. And yes, I know there are signs that the far right could be in trouble for the midterms and whatnot, and that's kind of what this guest is reaching out to me for. And I'm cautiously optimistic about that, assuming their policies don't outright destroy the world first, which, frankly, it seems like they could. And on that note, I had an opportunity to have a guest on my show who most certainly has an extreme, likely even apocalyptic worldview. It's someone who's apparently running for Congress as well, a so called White House faith advisor. Given that the White House is, a complete mess, it seems like this person is no wiser than some advisor on how to get your dick caught in your zipper even worse than usual. I think the world needs his advice about as much as I would need that kind of advice, Like, not that I've had that happen to me very often in the past, but I don't need advice on like how to be worse off than I was before. That's what ultimately these far right faith advisors are doing. They're making the world worse off, and they're actually ruining people's lives in some unexpected ways, and also in some perfectly predictable ways. Anyway, I actually did respond somewhat positively to that email. Believe it or not, I said I would accept the person as my guest if I could have a co-host on as well. So the person I reached out to actually agreed to be a co host. So it seemed like maybe this could actually happen as an episode. My co host would have been Scott K. Ernest, a former white nationalist activist and former Stormfront moderator who I once had as a guest on this podcast to discuss how he got out of that extremism. And I thought, you know what? Why not have him on to have like a debate slash discussion with this current extremist? However, the PR person that sent me the original email, the person who's promoting the White House Faith Advisor, actually did not respond to my response. And oddly enough, I did not even say who might be my co-host. So it was really not due to that reason even. So I guess I just got lost in the shuffle or something like that. So you got to just say shucky darn with something like that and move on. But I am going to talk about what the person sent in the email and also my own experience with, people on the far right. Despite being on the left, I do have experience with people on the far right. I live in a relatively red part of the blue state of Michigan, though it does seem like it could be getting bluer, perhaps, this area that I'm in. But, it's got a little bit of a Republican reputation. I have had MAGA housemates in the past, in the recent past. I have some immigrant bashing relatives who, despite perhaps being liberal on some things, nevertheless have some stupid hatred of immigrants. And you know this type of person, they for them having to press one for English on the phone is like a major crisis. It's like, oh no, I'm slightly annoyed by this thing I have to do, slightly inconvenienced. Therefore, the world has to, shape itself around me and my itsy bitsy little problems. That's the type of person I'm talking about here. And of course, you're always probably going to have uh, a prejudice of your own in your own brain, and hopefully, it won't go too far. It won't get too extreme. But there's always the potential for a person to become like more bigoted over time. So there's a little bit of a right winger in all of us, I think. And I've had teachers and coworkers who were right wingers. I've also had childhood friends who, in my view, went astray. There is actually, I'm going to name him here because, whatever. But there's a guy named Jeff Nukkala, and that's a Finnish name if you're wondering what kind of a, name that is, but it's Finnish. Anyway, Jeff Nukkala, he became a video producer and director for so called Catalyst Media, which helps create propaganda for various religious extremist groups like the so called Truth and Liberty Coalition. And for some reason, Jeff's website removed Turning Point USA as something he did work for. So maybe they're ashamed of Turning Point. I don't really know. But anyway, when I was a kid, I actually hung out with Jeff sometimes. Hell, I once even got off the school bus at his place back in the day. It might have even been something I did more than once. So, and his mom was actually the art teacher at the elementary school that I went to, at least for some time. So, I've known, religious right wingers. I mean, I don't know if he was exactly a right winger at the time that I hung out with him when I was younger, but you know, the point is I've known people like this. I know a stereotypical feminist who became a Tucker Carlson fan, so I don't think she's exactly a feminist anymore. So it proves that the feminist to fascist pipeline can be a very real thing. And back when I was doing more visual art, I did an art show at a gallery run by someone I later learned is a right wing loon. Now, I had mixed feelings about that collaboration in hindsight for that reason, but to be fair to myself, I don't even know if she was a right winger at the time. Sometimes people they change over time. For all I know, she might have become one of those years later after the fact. But still, it left some mixed feelings. So I'm saying all this for those who might claim I'm just I'm just a person in a left wing bubble. I would say you don't know me that well if that's what you think. In fact, I only wish we were somewhat more in that left wing bubble, so I could get further away from the right wing bubble that's turned the world into more of a hell on earth. And anyway, I better move on and get into the email that was sent by the publicist and then offer some more thoughts on it. So that email starts, it says, "Hi, Wade. I wanted to introduce you to a guest your audience will definitely want to hear from, Jackson Lawmeyer. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, but who knows? Anyway, back to the email. Jackson is a member of the White House Faith Advisory Board, published author and lead pastor of Sheridan Church. As we move toward the 2026 midterms, he's focused on one defining issue: the growing fight for the Christian vote. Both parties are now openly competing for faith based voters. We're seeing Democratic candidates increasingly use scripture and religious messaging in campaign rhetoric. So that must be referring to James Tallarico, and I have mixed feelings about him, using religious messaging, although I get it. Like, he's not only religious himself, but he's in a religious area of the country. So I get that, but I have mixed feelings about it at best. Anyway, you know, uh, going back to the email, while Republicans are working to solidify evangelical turnout and cultural alignment, Jackson offers a unique perspective. He's not just observing the shift, he's organizing pastors and congregations nationwide. Oh, goody. Anyway, it continues. Through his work on the White House Faith Advisory Board, he's engaged in conversations about religious liberty, cultural trends, and civic participation, and he can speak directly to how faith communities are being mobilized ahead of what many believe will be a decisive midterm cycle. He can discuss why both political parties are actively courting Christian voters, how scripture and faith language are being used strategically in campaigns, what pastors are hearing from congregations and about culture and politics, the turnout potential of organized faith communities in 2026. Boy, I hate that term, faith communities. It's like such a, it's such a, I guess, politically correct sounding term. But anyway, the email also mentions the broader question: can the church engage politically without losing spiritual integrity? Ooh, that's certainly a question that I care a lot about. I guess I'm kind of forced to care about that in a way, because that's one of the questions posed by a theocratic system. The you know you kind of are forced to engage with that question, whether you want to or not. Anyway, the email says Jackson also recently released his new book, Divided: Breaking Free from the Double Life, which explores the internal battle between who we are and who we're called to be. The message resonates deeply with believers navigating political and cultural tension, and ties directly into the identity questions shaping today's electorate. And then there's some recent interviews that are listed as like a reference that I could use. And that includes Real America's Voice with Dan Ball, and His Glory, and Daystar Ministry Now. So yeah. So here's me going on to debunk these right-wing Christian nationalist perspectives, based largely on what's in this email. So the White House Faith Advisory Board and its purpose, it's a it's a very iffy thing. The White House Faith Advisory Board, on which Jackson Lawmeyer apparently serves, represents a troubling entanglement of church and state that contradicts basic constitutional principles. This board it's institutionalized religious influence in governments, and it represents a direct threat to secular governance and religious pluralism. So, what about Jackson Lawmeyer's political ambitions and that whole Christian nationalism thing? Well, Lawmeyer is the pastor of Sheridan Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I would say he exemplifies the dangerous fusion of religious authority with political ambition. His candidacy for Congress and leadership of Pastors for Trump reveals how these religious identities are being weaponized for political gain. his previous failed Senate campaign against James Lankford, it demonstrated his willingness to use religious rhetoric for political advancement, including prayers that God would replace politicians who do not submit to your authority, which is a clear example of theocratic thinking. And of course, you know, the idea of submitting to authority, well, that doesn't sound like somebody who loves freedom and stuff like that. What about all these, freedom loving conservatives and whatnot? I don't want to submit to somebody's goddamn authority, especially some invisible man up in the sky, you know? So it's a little bit silly. Like there's some inherently deeply contradictory messages among these religious conservatives, because they're all like, "Don't tread on me, don't tread on me." Then when it comes to Trump or God, they're like, "Oh, tread all over me, baby." Like, in fact, tread harder. I want to feel like a lawnmower went over me. That's basically where they're at psychologically. It's actually kind of kinky, to be honest. I'm not much of a kink shamer, but when it comes to that, I think maybe some kinks should be shamed. Like, I think this one probably should be, stuffed way, way, way further into the closet. We don't need any of this dear daddy kind of government. They even went through well, they're probably still going through a phase where they literally are calling Trump daddy. I mean, tell me that is not like a kinky, well, it's not even deeply closeted, really, if you think about semi-closeted at best. But like, you know, these are the same people who would oddly enough like consider me like possibly a gay dude or whatever because I'm liberal. Yet they're calling the president daddy and shit like that. Like, there's something deeply wrong with some of these people. Well, practically all of these people, actually. But anyway, what about the religious liberty claims and how they clash with reality? Right wing perspectives on so called religious liberty, they mask attempts to secure special privileges for Christianity while undermining the rights of others. So Lohmeyer and his allies frame resistance to public health measures during COVID 19 as religious freedom issues, when in fact they represented a disregard for community health. His church's refusal to enforce masks or social distancing was, a little bit embarrassing and obviously anti science. Now, if I really, you know, wanted to, I guess, go after people for wearing masks and for the ability of people to wear masks in public, uh, I would be going after ICE agents. They're the ones who are most dangerous wearing masks. So even if you're one of those people who's like, oh, the masks didn't even work and blah blah blah, well, for starters, I have to wonder then, why do surgeons wear surgical masks while they perform surgeries? Is it because it's totally ineffective? Are they trying to make a fashion statement? What is it then? Why do some people have gloves on when they're you know doing certain tasks? Is it because they might avoid the spread of germs? Are there maybe flawed aspects to doing these things? Are they things that work perfectly? No, not necessarily, but you might reduce the chances of, transmission and that sort of thing. And then, of course, there is the spiritual warfare narrative, that pesky thing. The concept of spiritual warfare that Lohmeyer promotes, it's viewing politics as a battle between literal angels and demons, and it represents a dangerous delusion that justifies extreme political positions. That worldview, it frames political opponents not as people with different ideas, but as literal demons. It's wacky, and this. is a complete detachment from reality based political discourse. So, of course, that's where we're at right now. And then, of course, there's the myth of Christian persecution. Now, am I saying that Christians have never been persecuted in history, or that nothing bad ever happens to Christians, that they are never targeted? No, I'm not saying that. But the right wing narratives about Christians being persecuted in America ignore the reality that Christians maintain overwhelming numerical and political dominance in the United States, with 87.8% of Congress identifying as Christian, compared to 63% of the general population. Christians remain way overrepresented in power. And then there's the constitutional reality. The right wingers always love to say that they embrace the Constitution and blah, blah, blah. But despite claims from the religious right, the Constitution clearly establishes separation of church and state. The White House Faith Office, which has persisted across administrations, represents a problematic deviation from that basic principle. Americans United for Separation of Church and State has correctly criticized this institutionalized religious influence in government. And unfortunately, there are signs that this is not abating as much as it should. Now, I don't know if James Tallarico, if he's actually a secularist or not. I assume he's more secular than people on the far right. But it's still iffy to have all of these politicians engaging in religious talk. That is something that they should leave in their homes, not in the offices of government, and that is something that has been clearly established in the United States Constitution. The Anglican Church was actually disestablished as a government church by Thomas Jefferson. If you look into that, it's an interesting story, but it really gives you insight into what the so called founding fathers actually thought. They really were, to a large extent, actually believers in secular government, at least in most cases, as far as I know. Like, that's how they were engaged in these ideas. And when it comes to people like Thomas Jefferson, I know he was a deeply flawed person and all that kind of stuff. But nevertheless, when these right wingers bring the founding fathers up or whatever, it's it's always the case that they just omit basic facts like that, and they even try to promote the Constitution as if it's a religious document. Well, it's actually not really a particularly religious document. And the 2026 midterm election context itself is pretty interesting here. The notion that both parties are competing for Christian voters kind of misrepresents the reality of American politics. While Republicans have explicitly courted evangelical voters through figures like Lawmeyer, Democrats' use of religious language typically reflects a diversity of their constituency rather than a specific strategy to win Christian voters. The focus on faith based voters as a monolithic bloc ignores the diversity of religious perspectives and the growing number of non religious Americans. So, like when it comes to James Tallarico, I think he at least substantially engages in religious talk because, well, he is a religious person, and he's probably applying a strategy as well. But I don't know how exactly specific his aim is. Like, I don't think the idea there is just to get Christian voters. I think he's trying to present himself as sort of a unifying figure, and he's trying to engage with all of the citizens. And, of course, he's trying to bring Christianity more into I don't know, a Jesus like approach. The far right would have you believe that Jesus, he carried around a machine gun. He hated immigrants. He hated anyone in the LGBT community or anything like that. Boy, I found myself just using community. I I normally don't like words like words like that because they sound so like they do sound so stereotypically PC, I guess, like the faith-based community or this or that. It's just one of those things. But when it comes to religious Americans, there have always been liberal religious people. There are liberal leaning Muslims, but of course, people on the far right in America would have you believe that all Muslims are like extremists and all that kind of stuff. So I would say there are too many extremists of all different religious backgrounds. Well, maybe not all, but you know what I mean. All major religions have their share of extremists, and there are some theological inconsistencies as well. Lawmeyer's alignment with state power actually contradicts Christian teachings about serving the marginalized rather than the powerful. His support for the so called America First agenda and association with figures like Michael Flynn and Rudy Giuliani, it really shows how Christianity is being twisted to support nationalist and authoritarian politics rather than actually challenging power structures, which is actually what Jesus did. Jesus wouldn't have been like rolling with the billionaires and shit like that. What are you kidding me? He once argued that the the rich man has no better chance of getting into heaven than a camel would fit through the eye of a needle. That's what Jesus actually says in the Bible. And he says to love immigrants the same way you might love your neighbor or something like that. Now, the book Divided and Political Manipulation, uh, it's all a part of this messaging, like in that email, he's or the PR person is trying to make it seem like uh, this is somebody who's got serious ideas, and there are some real uh, things to hear with him, like some original content could be derived from it. But Lawmeyer's book appears to be another example of how religious concepts are being commodified for political gain and the framing of identity questions shaping today's electorate or whatever. It's a it's a it's a laughable concept. It's saying that they're primarily spiritual matters, but it ignores the material conditions and systemic issues that actually shape political outcomes. Like like it's all just a spiritual battle or something like that. No, it's also to do with policy and you know things that actually impact people's real lives and whatnot. And that's what we're finding out with the war in Iran and stuff. People are dying, and the genocide in Gaza, which we're not supposed to call a genocide, and we're supposed to heap endless praise upon Benjamin Netanyahu and the country of Israel. And that whole situation demonstrates to me the virtue of not having an ethno state, not having a theocratic government. Because think about it like this: if you are advocating for the idea of a theocratic government or an ethno state, and those governments do something wrong, well, you're kind of asking for people to blame those groups for whatever evils are being done by that particular government. You're literally asking for just random people to pay the price.